So in today's video, I'm going to show you a really simple way to paint watercolor wreaths in Procreate. The process is pretty simple. We're basically just going to paint a handful of botanical elements like this, and then we'll combine them together into the final wreath. As usual, I'll list the brushes I'm using in the description below. So as you can see, I've already got some kind of elements sketched out here, and you can download this sketch for free in the description as well. I've just placed it up here as the top layer and then set it to multiply. And then I'll lower the opacity way down just so I can barely see it. Then to start painting, I'll make sure I'm on a blank layer down here below everything. And I think I'll start with this one. So for the brush, I'm going to use the Shoto brush. And I'm going to do most of these kind of stroke based, and I'll just go down and sort of alternate the leaves like this. Then for the stem, I'll shrink the brush size just a tiny bit, and I'll carefully sketch that out. And this looks pretty good, but I think the colors are too consistent. So next, I'm going to show you how to add some natural variation to this. So first, I'll choose a darker version of my green tone that's also a little bit bluer. And I'm just going to do a couple of really dark leaves just on one side. There we go. Then where these kind of come together, I'll use a super dark green tone just to kind of highlight that area. And then lastly, I'll choose a very light green tone that's a little bit more yellowy. And I'll use this to make a few lighter leaves on the left side. And all this so far is basically just to get the kind of tones and the colors in the right place. So next we need to blend this to soften it up. So to do that, I'll just tap on the layer and set it to alpha lock. Then I'll grab the background water blender and I'll just carefully kind of using a light pressure just soften this up and blend it a little bit, but I'll try not to move the colors too much. And then to make this just a little bit more light and airy, I'll just brighten it and desaturate it a little bit. And once this first one is finished, we can move on to the next one. And I'll make sure I do this on a separate layer. And I'm going to start by adding basically a bunch of pine needles, and I'm going to use the annoying pen brush for that. I'll use a pretty deep, kind of bluish green tone, and I'll just go along it like this, doing these kind of long angled strokes. For the stem, I'll use a slightly darker green. And I'll also add a couple of random dark needles as well. After that, I'll make a new layer and move on to this one. And this time, I'm going to do it all using the rough quill brush. And I'll start by filling it out using a bright red tone. And I'll do my best to leave kind of a highlight on each berry. After that, I'll use a darker red tone. And I'll use this kind of in the shadow areas, so just under the berries, and then also where all these stems come together. And it's optional, but there's a really easy way to add a sort of ombre fade so the stem fades to green. So to do that, I'll grab the freehand selection tool. I'll just select the bases of all the stems. I'll feather it out around 10%. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll brighten it, desaturate it, and then shift the color until I find a sort of yellowish green tone. And lastly, the two remaining leaves are pretty simple. I'm just going to fill those out on the rough quill, and I'll make sure they're on separate layers as well. And at this point, with all 5 elements finished, I'm going to go through and sort of slightly adjust the colors of each one. And the reason I do this is because just for me, it's hard for me to choose the right colors on the fly while I'm painting. But when I see them all finished like this, I can tell that maybe some are too saturated or some aren't the right shade, and this is a great time to adjust them. And in this case, it's a pretty subtle difference, but I think it looks better. Next, I'm going to move on, and I'm just going to use the arrow tool to sort of move these around and try to arrange them into a circle. I'll do my best not to overlap stuff too much, but it's okay if it happens once in a while. And then also during this process, I will duplicate some of the elements and warp them just to make them fit a little bit better. And there we go. I think this arrangement looks pretty good. Now, as you can see, it did turn out a little bit lopsided and not perfectly circular. So if you want, this is pretty easy to fix. So if you want to fix it, I recommend just merging all the different parts of the wreath just together onto one layer like that. Then you can grab the arrow tool and set it to warp and just use it to sort of stretch and bounce the wreath and make the sort of end result a little bit more circular. And sometimes it happens when you warp the wreath like this, some of the berries will get stretched out and sort of oblong. And if that's bothering you, you can easily fix it. Just use the liquefy tool set to push. And you can kind of individually unstretch them. And just like that, this watercolor wreath is finished. Now before I go, I wanted to mention a couple of tips that really helped me. The first one is, when you're arranging the final wreath, I recommend spacing out the elements a little bit. This could definitely be a personal thing with me, but I feel like if the elements are kind of too close together and overlapping, it gives the wreath a kind of anxious vibe. The other thing is, when you're arranging the wreath, you might notice that particular elements stand out a little bit too much. So in this situation, I would try to make the kind of obvious elements a little bit more subdued, maybe by changing its position or just lightening the colors. And that pretty much wraps it up. As always, if you think I've earned it, please give this video a like, and here are 2 more watercolor tutorials I think you'll love to watch next.